All right. Hello, everyone. I see that there are people filtering in. So as we fill up the room, first I want to say I'm having a little camera issue, so sorry for the the blurriness here. Um, but I am Stacia. I'm a program specialist here at EWA. And we want to thank you today for joining the Education Writers Association for our webinar, Rethinking How Journalists Write About Young People. I'm going to hand the microphone over to today's moderator, who is Bethany Au of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Bethany covers young adults for the health section with a focus on mental, sexual, and preventative health. So Bethany, take it away.
Thanks, Stacia. As a health reporter who covers young people primarily, I write a lot about adolescents, and I'm constantly thinking about the impact my writing has on my readers and on the young people I write about as well. So for that reason, I'm really happy to be here for this discussion about framing adolescence. Today's speaker, Marissa Gerstein-Pinot, is a principal researcher and strategist at the Frameworks Institute, a Washington, D.C. based think tank that uses social science methods to study how people understand social issues. Marissa, can you tell us a little bit about what you'll be presenting for us today? And maybe tell us a little bit more about the work that the Frameworks Institute does and your role as a researcher and strategist?
Sure. So, hi, everyone. My name is Marissa Gerstein-Pinot. I work for the Frameworks Institute, as Bethany said. And the Frameworks Institute is a social science think tank that focuses on communications for social change and science translation. So we have been doing over the past, I think, close to 3 years now, and it's not quite done in terms of making sure that people get these strategies and in their own hands and are able to use them. But we spent the past 2 years doing research on how people think about adolescence and developing framing strategies for communicating more effectively about adolescence and really changing the narrative away from what is often a fairly negative depiction of young people into something that is more positive and that can lead to more positive change in systems and structures that serve adolescents, that adolescents interact with every day. So this was work that was actually funded by a collaborative of different foundations, including, there's many of them, I won't list all of them, but the Annie Casey Foundation, the Hilton Foundation, the Ford Foundation, a number of other ones who came together and funded this work along with the work of a National Academy's expert panel on adolescent development. So if any of you have seen The Promise of Adolescence, this work was going on in tandem. And as a principal researcher and strategist, I was involved in the research end and did some of the research myself. And now I'm really heavily involved in, as I said, getting this work into the hands of people who think and talk about adolescents and young people and youth issues every day. So that includes researchers and advocates, but also definitely journalists. So I'm really excited to be here today and get to speak to all of you. Okay. So can everybody see my screen?
Yes,
I guess we can. Yes, okay, yeah. Thank you. I'm gonna shut down my camera so that we can really focus on what I'm saying in my slides instead of my face. So,
this is Stacia, disembodied voice Stacia. Bethany, if you want to shut your camera down too during the presentation, just so our audience can see a little better.
So let me jump in. I guess I already sort of explained who I am and who Frameworks is. So we are actually going to get started with a quick quiz that's sort of a getting to know you all and hopefully a fun introduction to the presentation. So I think the quiz is going to pop up for everybody to answer. So it looks like we have a couple things that are tied. So one of them being the difficulties that adolescents face today, which I think I have plenty to sort of help you all think about how you can write about that in our conversation today. And then stories about activism or community engagement, which is fantastic because those are stories that we really want to sort of uplift and I think are particularly important right now in our current situation for various reasons that I think we all recognize. And then it's great to see that people are also working on racial ethnic disparities between adolescents, and I'm going to have some stuff to say about that as well. And then it looks like brain development wasn't on at the top of anybody's list. I'm actually going to have some things to say about that I still think will be really helpful because development is such an important part of the conversation right now in the media and of course in science around adolescence as well. So thank you all for taking the quiz. So let me start with sort of a quick framing 101. What are we talking about when we say framing? Because it's a word that especially I feel like in the past 4 or 5 years has become, is used a lot more, and it depends on the person in terms of what it means. So let's talk about what I'm talking about when I say framing. So frames are sets of choices that we all make when we're presenting information. So it's what we emphasize when we present it, how we explain whatever we're showing to people or talking about, what we say, and a lot of times what we leave unsaid. So I think an important thing to realize when we talk about framing is that we're always making framing decisions, whether we're conscious of it or not, really in any conversation or communications, but especially in ones that are sort of as deliberate and considered as journalism, you're deciding what you're going to lead with, right? So you're pretty much always framing. You're deciding what the central point is that you want people to understand about the topic that you're writing about. And I would argue that even when you decide, I'm not going to frame this, I'm just going to present data, or I'm just going to present, facts, that is actually a framing decision as well that has consequences for how people sort of encounter and process what you're communicating with them. So the choices that in how we present information, all of those things that I just said in terms of what we're emphasizing, how we're explaining things, these have real and important effects on how people understand, how they feel, and how they act. And I think that we often tend to think that people are just sort of passive receptacles for information, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, but our words have real meaning and real consequences in the world, as all of you know. But this is something that, again, I think sometimes we're conscious of and sometimes we're not, and thinking in a really deliberative way is an important aspect of framing. So this is sort of our theory of change, the ways in which good framing can make social change or can improve people's understanding of complex issues. I realize that it looks very linear, but we actually, I'm trying to represent in those round circles of arrows, excuse me, that these things don't often move in a linear fashion. So you might change communication, and then that changes the way people talk about things, which influences how they think about it, and then influences their support for policies or programs. And they might vote a different way or advocate for something different from their politicians. But sometimes this actually can happen in the opposite way. Sometimes you start with policies, and then people start communicating about it, and then people shift. Thinking shifts. But I'm going to come back to this slide in a couple seconds and talk about how we see journalism and media as where the sort of place is in these circles, where there's like the critical points where journalism has a lot of impact. So the first thing that we do in our research, so I think I failed to mention earlier, so we are a social science organization, so we do communications, but we come at communications from sort of a different angle than a lot of other comms folks do, in that all of us are trained as PhDs in the social sciences. So I am a sociologist. I work with anthropologists, psychologists, linguists, political scientists, and we bring all of our sort of skills and theories of knowledge to creating these strategies. And what we know is that it's really important to see what you're up against, see where your messages are going and what might be barriers to those messages and those communications and those attempts at explanation. Seeing what you're up against and also recognizing the places where there are opportunities to really improve people's knowledge and understanding and make change. So as I said, we're a little bit different from other communications organizations, and that's because a lot of times theories behind communications, at least historically, have been that people are sort of empty fishbowls if they don't know about the topic you're writing about. So they don't have any preconceived notions. You can kind of drop your information into their heads like fish, it'll swim around happily. They totally understand what it is that you're trying to say. What we know from social science research is that that's not how cognition happens. There's actually a lot of things going on in people's minds that are going to influence how they read your article or, you know, listen to your interview, et cetera, even if it's a topic that they previously didn't know anything about. So the things that are sort of already in that fishbowl, that are already in the ecosystem of people's minds, are what we call cultural models. So these are assumptions and beliefs that all of us have that are created through experiences, expectations, and through the culture that we're living in and through the institutions that we interact with. So they're deeply built into our culture and our, you know, sort of the structure of our society, to the extent that they're kind of taken for granted, right? Like we see a person or we see a fact or we see a particular thing and we can make an almost snap judgment about what it is and what its meaning is. And we rely on these cultural models to interpret and organize and really make meaning of experiences. So it's critical to understand what these are when you're crafting any sort of communication, whether it's, you know, writing a journal article or putting together a tweet or, you know, some sort of social media post. These things are always present when we're creating communications that we share. So what we did for this project for adolescents is we talked to everyday Americans across the country and did a combination of long form 2-hour interviews with people where we really like got sort of deep into their thinking about adolescents and teenagers. We also did on the street interviews, which I would love to show you all video of, but this platform is a little, it would be a little difficult to watch on this platform, but hopefully another time. We also did focus groups and other types of research to really understand, okay, what are these cultural models that are already there? What is the ecosystem of understandings that people bring to any discussion about young people, youth, adolescents, et cetera? And what we found were a number of what we call traps in public thinking. So these are the places where you know, people who are immersed in these issues around adolescence and youth sort of understand things in a particular way and think that everybody does, but actually there are really dominant ways of thinking out there that you end up coming up against when you're talking. So I'm not going to go through every single one. One of, I think, the really dominant ones that came through in that quiz was this idea of adolescence as being a really risky time. It's a very dangerous time. And the way people think about this, and I'm sure all of you have encountered this before, is that, you know, adolescents are kind of like aliens. They do really crazy things. They don't have any impulse control. You know, they do stuff that we just can't understand, and it's an inherently difficult, dangerous, risky time for teenagers. And most of us make it through it. It's like trial by fire, but then some kids don't make it through it and end up in real big trouble, but there's not much we can do about it. Another one that I think is critical is the idea of self-makingness. So this is just a way of viewing the world as very individualistic, right? And again, this is an American way of thinking. Well, if you have the drive, you can overcome whatever it is that you need to overcome. You can do it yourself, and it makes it hard for people to understand the ways in which, you know, the education system or the criminal justice system or different sort of systems and structures and racism in our country actually make it so that, you know, even if you have the drive you supposedly need, it's very hard to succeed. We're going to come across what we call modernity's threat. So, you know, teens are facing a really troubled world. And I think particularly in 2020, the coverage that that we've seen, and this is not that it isn't true, but it has very much reinforced the idea that we are living in a dangerous world where there are risks to adolescents that didn't exist before. Social media has always been one, but of course now with education in the state that it is, you know, this also overlaps with the dangerous times in terms of, you know, young people sort of running amok because they're not in school or they're not in college or they don't care about anybody and are going to beaches in Miami. So lots of that. The culture of poverty, and I put culture in quotes because it's an assumption that certain groups in our country, primarily Black groups, that's how people think of Black communities, they just don't have good values. It's not that they faced racism or discrimination, it's just they don't care about education. And so that's why Black teens, for instance, in people's minds don't have great outcomes. So it sounds like not many people are talking about brain development, but I think an interesting thing that we're going to talk about is that people don't see brain development as important for adolescents. And then biological takeover, please forgive the use of the F word in that, but I just thought it was such a great quote. I had to go with it, but I'm sure all of you have heard of the hormones discussion narrative about crazy hormones many times. So these are the traps that when we're communicating, when you're writing articles about adolescents, your communication is potentially falling into, even if that's not the topic that you were trying to address, or you're sort of trying to get people away from thinking these particular things and more towards a different set of information or understandings. It can be hard to sort of navigate around this. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today, is some of the framing strategies to help ensure that when you're communicating, you actually don't fall into these traps, but are able to actually create a bridge over them and make sure that you're conveying the information that you want to in the most effective ways. So in addition to the interviews with the public, we also did an analysis of media narratives to see, you know, what was going on in media and journalism in terms of talking about adolescents. And we used a sort of a quantitative method to distill what were the dominant narratives. And we found 3 that were particularly dominant, particularly maybe unhelpful, considering that we know what the traps are and what the stories are that people are already telling themselves. So most articles focused on negative influences like peers and bad outcomes, which reinforces that sort of dangerous times way of thinking. We found that articles about criminal justice also reinforced that sort of danger and peers as bad influences, but didn't talk about development and the fact that, you know, adolescents are changing in various ways, not just their brains, but their identity, et cetera, and that we need to be attended to sort of those developmental processes when we're talking about the criminal justice system. And then the last one that we found that was particularly common were articles about mental health and social media, and which usually assumed or talked about how social media was inherently harmful to young people. I feel like now that with COVID-19 and just the fact that all of us are online in various ways more and more, I've seen some better coverage of that, or some less, you know, risky coverage of that, with this idea that actually social media can have benefits. And I think that's shifting a little bit. But a lot of it has historically reinforced this idea that there's sort of nothing we can do short of taking away their phones. And even that probably isn't going to work to prevent adolescents from facing the threat of social media in the modern world. So knowing all of that, you know, we know the stories that people are telling themselves, and we know that what the dominant stories are that are in media right now. And I don't want to say that's monolithic. That's just the ones that we saw the most of when we did our analysis. I want to talk again about this idea that frames can help make change, and where we see media and journalism as sort of fitting into this. So, you know, when you're writing, whenever you're writing about adolescence, you're sort of feeding in a positive or negative way into this discourse about adolescence and around adolescence. So journalists can not only reinforce these ways of thinking, but I think really importantly can also disrupt previous understandings and help people get to a place where they're more likely to think of adolescence as a time of opportunity and resilience, and not just danger and risk. And, you know, because you have so much influence on culture and on discourse, you're really important to culture change. And so I'm hoping that sort of the recommendations that I'm going to talk about and the strategies for talking about adolescence are helpful. You know, I realize also, and I've had this conversation with Stacia and with Bethany about how journalists also, you all also are in a particular niche or world that is not advocacy and it's not research. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But I think that understanding that your unique role is not just about being objective, but also about creating a better understanding and a more informed electorate, puts you in a really unique position and gives you a lot of power in terms of changing the way people think about adolescence. And you know, that is really exciting to me. So I'm thrilled that I get to do this with you all today. So we have another quiz. I'm really interested to get your thoughts on some of the stuff that I already talked about. Okay, so it looked like the sort of the dangerous times is definitely what you all see the most of, and that is not surprising to me. It is such a dominant narrative around adolescence in this country. Culture of poverty is also, and I'm going to talk some about, you know, how to talk about race and poverty in ways that help people understand better that it's not culture, it's about systems. And then the modernity of as threat and self-makingness are tied as well. So yeah, these are all very important ways of thinking that we want to be cognizant of as we are writing our stories and communicating. So thank you all so much for taking the quiz. So the overall strategy that we came to actually has, we call it changing the big idea. So there's a big theme that we're changing, which is the narrative around danger and vulnerability to a narrative around opportunity and resilience. So there's a number of framing strategies that we then recommend within the sort of larger changing of the narrative and the big idea. I'm going to focus on a few of them, not all of them today. But this is sort of the larger idea that we want to think about. So our first recommendation is around advancing a positive vision of young people and their development. And this is a real change from that, danger, risk, adolescents are aliens. Adolescent is a bad time of life for a lot of people that you just have to get through, towards promoting and talking about the fact that adolescence really is a time of opportunity. It's a time of remarkable growth, cognitive growth, social growth, emotional growth, where there are so many chances to not only make sure that there are better long-term outcomes for young people, but also sort of repair some of the potential damages of earlier adversity. And this is something that is in the science. Researchers, if you read the National Academy's report, know that this is true, but it's not getting communicated. Instead, we keep sort of falling back on telling the same old story about adolescence being a really bad time, which just leads to people thinking about, well, strong individuals or kids who grow up in the right families are going to do fine. But for kids who, come from these quote unquote bad cultures or bad communities, then there's kind of nothing that we can do about them. And so we want to move people away from that kind of thinking and towards what we call more productive ways of thinking about adolescence. So here's sort of a from to before and after I'm going to show you that are typical ways of talking about adolescence. So the first one is about, it starts off with younger adolescents are particularly vulnerable. And then it has interesting stuff in the next part of the sentence and important stuff about developing skills to make their own decisions, but it set everything up as being about vulnerability instead of resilience. And then another way of talking about it could start with that idea of making their own decisions. And then, there are solutions, there are ways of creating positive engagement. There's ways of changing the way that, the education system, et cetera, to make better outcomes for young people. And I think what's really fascinating, I'll probably talk about this again, I'm going to show you a few sort of articles that I took and reframed, is something like the two that I have here is embedded in articles about adolescence at some point, almost always, but it's almost always towards the end. It's not what we start with. So I think, it's not that the stories aren't telling this in this way. It's an ordering issue in part, and it's missing an opportunity to just lead with something different. So this is something that I took straight from the New York Times a couple of years ago. As you can see, it's about social media and how problematic it is for adolescents. But what was really interesting when I read the article is that the words that you see right here were in the article. It said adolescent social media use requires a holistic approach, I think in like the third or fourth paragraph. So instead of setting things up as, this is a really big problem that we need to be scared of, but instead setting up as there's an approach that we can take that is positive, that can address a need that's actually out there, is a different way of framing that particular problem. So that's one example. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is, again, I mentioned this earlier, is talking about the brain. And I am now cognizant of the fact that most of you have not necessarily written articles about this, but it is something that's sort of bubbling up more and more. And I have seen a number of articles about them. And I think what we've seen is that instead of starting with identity and social and emotional development, a lot of articles just jump right into talking about the brain. And what we know is that everyday Americans don't think that adolescent development is about the brain. That actually kind of turns them off. That's what our research showed. So I have video, but I couldn't show it to you all today, but I pulled some quotes from it that, you know, just showed, like, we showed somebody a message about adolescent brain development that started that way. And we got so much pushback from people saying, what are you talking about? You know, this sounds like a doctor's, you know, visit. My brain is my brain, you know. We're talking about drugs and alcohol. When you bring in the brain, this just sounds silly. So that was the pushback that we got, and that's what led us to really think about the fact that when you want to talk about brain and cognitive development, you need to think about what you want to introduce first before you start talking about the brain. It's, again, an ordering issue. So, you know, from the brain is rapidly forming connections to, you know, adolescents are learning about the world around them and, you know, how to sort of deal with that world, new world for them. So, sorry about that. I think I have a bit of an ordering problem here. So then the last one that I wanted to talk about was, and this goes to talking about racial and ethnic inequities and how we tackle that. And this is so important right now as well. I mean, I think it's always been an important issue, but there's a more focused attention with Black Lives Matter on, and with education and the fact that we have virtual schooling on inequities amongst adolescents, and the importance of actually explaining why those are there, as opposed to just describing disparities between young people, which doesn't get you where you want to go. So, oh, that's why it was out of order. Okay, so let me just do this really quickly. So this is another article. I realize it's an opinion contributor about brains, and I thought this was really good because this is like the worst framing ever. Not only is it about adolescents living in dangerous, risky times and making bad decision making, but also you just have to blame their brains, which, you know, I think it was kind of a cute title, but ends up pushing people into all sorts of different traps that they can't get out of. You know, they're not going to come back and say, oh, now I really understand brain development after they're introduced to something like that. So this is a couple of things that I pulled from it. So almost right away, it started talking about adolescent brains are different in others' adolescents in a lot of ways. There are stark differences, et cetera. You know, the key words, no impulse control. But then buried 7 paragraphs in was talk about interventions and how we can make sure that adolescents, you know, don't have risky behaviors by playing up on their social and emotional development. They want to feel worthy of respect and admiration. We need to bring them into engagement and meaning and understanding the importance of their own lives. So I redid the headline for this, and hopefully a better way that took what was in that 7th paragraph and just moved it to the top, right? Like, if young people will join with us in these efforts, if we enlist them, and then talking about like what we know about brain development helps us address that. So I'm sorry for that other slide that was kind of misplaced, but going back to describing disparities and explaining inequality, what we often find is that in our analysis of the media narratives is and in advocacy materials, is that people will talk about different groups being at higher risk for something, higher risk for dropout or higher risk for mental health programs, et cetera, but without telling people right up front why that risk is there. So as soon as somebody reads that, their minds are going to go to, again, something like culture, quote unquote, culture of poverty and bad parenting and things like that, as opposed to understanding that it might be about discrimination, harassment, violence, systemic, racism, et cetera. So making sure that that explanation comes as soon as you possibly can get it in there. Again, that we're trying to, I think, because as journalists, you're trying to educate people and help them understand things better, that this is really critical, that you're not cueing people to go in directions that you don't want them to go. So this is just some evidence for how important it is to actually frame your facts and give structural explanations when we ask people about their support for equitable policies. We actually found, as you can see, that giving people a structural explanation really helped. So this is my last example. Almost done talking. This is an article that came out not too long after lockdown. I think it was in it was in April, so pretty soon afterwards, based on a poll that Common Sense Media did, where they asked young people about a variety of things going on in terms of education, and also their own feelings. And this was the headline that came out, which was 4 in 10 US teens say they haven't done online learning since schools closed. And again, it's just that unframed data. Data doesn't speak for itself ever. As we know from our research and also from our social science research more generally about cognition, data isn't falling into that empty fishbowl, right? There's an ecosystem that it's falling into. And so as soon as people see this kind of data, they fall straight into a trap, even before they've read anything else in the article. And I think we all know too that people don't read a lot of times very deeply into articles. They sort of look at a headline, maybe read the first paragraph and move on. So what you're leading with is really important. And giving people cues that build understanding right away is really critical. So, if something like distance learning is not reaching 4 in 10 US teens, instead of 4 in 10 US teens say they're not doing online learning, which implies that it's sort of on them, that they're the ones responsible, versus distance learning or schools not reaching them, which is the system, I think is a really important distinction to make. And I guess just, one last thing on this particular article is the picture, which when I look at it closer, I see what it's trying to do, but depicting a Black male teenager in shadow like that is actually a really unhelpful and counterproductive way to depict a minority teenager. So I just want to note that. I'm sure the person who wrote this article had nothing to do with that picture, but it jars me every time I see it. So I always like to end on a quote, and I thought this was great because it came straight. It's wonky, it's sort of researchy, but it came straight out of an article about how we talk about the young and the old in the time of COVID. That's just really well framed and talks about how young people actually, have goals, that they care about their communities. They can articulate these things clearly when we let them. And this actually bodes really well for their well-being and, for their resilience. And I think that that's a story that, especially around coronavirus, that has not been told as often as it should be. And we need to think about creating that balance so that people understand that there's hope for the future, and understand how we can make sure that young people have what they need, as opposed to always having these sort of really negative depictions that make people feel very fatalistic about the outcomes for young people, including for their own children. I have an 11-year-old in 6th grade, and doom and gloom is definitely something I can fall back on. But when I read things like this, it makes me feel much more positive about her future.
Bethany, I know you had a couple questions, and then we're going to go to audience questions after that.
Yeah, so my first question is, when it comes to the professional responsibility of journalists and topics such as risk, danger, vulnerability, there are many journalists who might argue that they feel obligated to tell these stories in those terms. Doing otherwise, such as your recommendation to advance a positive view of young people and their development, may come a little bit too close to advocacy in some people's minds. So how would you respond to those concerns?
Yeah, and I think those are really valid, and that's why I wanted to sort of throughout address them. And again, I think that what's so important about journalism is that journalists have a large megaphone and are very influential, even when they're being objective, right? So I think there's nobody who would say that media is irrelevant. Well, maybe some people would say that, but I think that they're wrong. And my understanding of the purpose of journalism is to create, to inform people, and ideally create a better informed citizenry that are more able to take part in democracy and in, our country in various ways. And that's, so if we want to change the way, if we want to ensure that those things continue, then I think there's two things. I think there is, to some degree, a responsibility to frame well and to frame adolescents well, and make sure that we bet that our culture has a better understanding about the positive ways in which adolescents can, continue, and also in the ways that we can support them in positive ways, and that it is a positive time in our lives, and it's a positive thing for all of us. So I think that there is sort of inherently, when you're talking about any important social issue, there is a framing that's going on, and there is some responsibility to think about what that framing is and what its impact is on the people who are reading about it. But also, I really feel that journalists are already doing this. Like, in every article that I read when I was preparing for this presentation, somewhere in that article was really great positive information about positive solutions and how we can ensure that adolescence is a positive developmental experience, and how it can benefit all of us. Like, it was always in there. So it's a matter of ordering and positioning that part of the story somewhere earlier on, so that people get that information and they haven't, sort of tuned out or stopped reading by the time they get there. So I think that, that I hope that that's an answer to that question. But I also understand, like, it can be walking a fine line. And I think the things I talked more specifically about today are ones that framing recommendations that I think are potentially maybe not easier, but can be embedded in media stories more easily without that sort of sense of being uncomfortable with their role.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And kind of along the same vein, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about whether there are particular cultural models or traps in thinking that journalists are more susceptible to in their coverage of adolescents.
I mean, I think the dangerous times one is really problematic, as we saw, over and over again when we were doing the narrative analysis. I think the other one is I think the culture pushing people sort of towards the trap of culture of poverty is something that everyone needs to be cognizant of, because I think journalists in particular are very aware of sort of more structural explanations for why there are disparities between youth of color and white youth, or other forms of difference. But actually explaining why those things happen, sometimes it just doesn't occur. So you start off with a story that says in fairly blunt terms that Black adolescents are more likely to enter the school to prison pipeline. Well, we know that people's assumption when they read that is likely to be, not always, but is likely to be, Black boys are more dangerous. They probably come from bad, environments. Maybe they were dealing drugs, so thinking about how you can get explanation there first, as opposed to just talking about disparities, is really critical. And I think especially right now where we're seeing an opportunity to change the conversation around race, the more explanation, the better.
Well, thank you, Marissa, for your presentation. Everything is fascinating. We have several audience questions, and actually 2 of them are coming from reporters in California who are currently, there is an initiative called Vote 16 to lower the voting age in California to allow 16-year-olds to vote in school board elections. And so these reporters are asking if, they're trying to write stories about this. And one of the counter arguments is that young people are just going to vote like their parents. And are they really mature enough to understand what they're voting for? So can you talk through maybe some alternative frames? How would you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's talking about sort of in community engagement and specifically civic engagement, and the fact that young people, when they feel enfranchised, when they're sort of, we know from the research, and you can cite this research, that when young people see that there's like a real opportunity to make a difference, that is very, very important to them. And they want to get involved. So talking about it in terms of civic engagement is actually an important part of becoming an adult. And again, like the research shows this, and using that frame of community connections and civic engagement would probably be really helpful for that.
Ki Sung at KQED asked she said she's curious if you have any insight into how stories that are reframed compare with the status quo in terms of page views and engagement. So, as journalists, Ki says, I know in terms of public service, we're supposed to be as fair and accurate as possible, but there are genuine algorithms to swim against in the media world.
Yeah, and so we have not started measuring that. We've actually been trying to figure out good ways to measure when frames get out into the wild, what is the impact and how they change. I think the one sort of example that we have, and this is from 20 years of working with the National Scientific Council for Early Childhood Development, where we worked on frames with them 20 years ago. So the metaphor of brain architecture and the metaphor of toxic stress, which are not things that they were using to talk about early childhood development, and now are so pervasive in media discourse. I mean, for that, like, just Google brain arc. I'm sure you've heard these terms, but just Google brain architecture or toxic stress, and they're all over the place. So part of the reason why that worked so well was persistence on the part of the scientists, but also on the part of a lot of other people, including journalists, to just keep using these frames over and over and over again. And so, frames work best in high doses. In terms of, are they going to get traction right away? I don't know. I would assume that it is a bit of an uphill battle, because the sort of dangerous, risky, vulnerable narrative is so deeply entrenched. But it was really, the research that we did was really fascinating in terms of, when you give people good frames, it can really move their thinking, and they can start talking about something in a very different way. So,
yeah. And I just want to say, I know that you all have a lot of these reports on your website. Is there a link that is it this Frameworks Institute issues and the Child and Adolescent Development page? Is that a good page for people to go and look?
That's a good page to start to look for the stuff that's on adolescence. We have both of our adolescence reports on there, and a research webinar. We also wrote a framing brief on how to talk about adolescence in the time of COVID that came out in early May. That's based on that research. And then so there's a number of things online.
So speaking of talking about and talking to adolescents during COVID, our reporters are going out, and a lot of them are interviewing adolescents. And one reporter, Anna Wolf, who is a poverty reporter with Mississippi Today, says that she's been writing about and interviewing and spending time with children the last few weeks, really for the first time in her career. And she feels a little awkward. And so she's wondering if you can offer any tips on interviewing children and adolescents, and how it's different from interviewing adults. Because, one thing that journalists really want to do, and Anna points out, is include the voices of the people that they're writing about. But of course, the story that you get from children and adolescents is different from expert narratives about the challenges that they face. So, how do you suggest reconciling these narratives and honoring the perspective of the kids themselves? And then also, if you have any tips about interviewing.
Yeah, I mean, so we generally don't interview children and adolescents, although for this project, one of my research partners did interview adolescents, and it was interesting because he mostly found that adolescents think in very similar ways to adults about adolescence, although their sort of level of focus on some of these, like what we call traps or the cultural models, sometimes were different in terms of the level to which they focused on one or another. I agree that talking to young people is so incredibly important. As I haven't done, I don't have any particular tips other than let them talk. I have an 11-year-old. Sometimes trying to get her to talk doesn't work so well. But I really believe from this research and other projects I've done, the young people want to talk about their lives and what they experience and what they've seen. The issue is often that they assume people don't listen. So being a good listener, I think. Yeah.
So shifting gears just a little, Titilayo Tinubu Ali, who's with the Southern Regional Education Board, a group that works with policymakers on issues that affect children and adolescents. She, or I'm not sure, they ask about your presentation, assuming that these frames are with the audience of the general public in mind. So they're wondering if you've researched how these frames on adolescence land with those reporters or writers out there in our EWA community who are writing for a policymaker audience. And if you have an example of how you would tweak a frame with policymakers with that audience in mind. And sorry, that's the Southern Education Foundation, not SREB. Sorry. Thank you for correcting me.
Yeah, so we didn't do very specific how do you communicate with policymakers, because we really are looking for like the broadest possible audience. But of course, depending on who you're talking to, you're going to use your frames in somewhat different ways while still kind of staying true to what they are. Because I mean, one thing that, so policymakers have sort of their own particular interests and needs within the realm that they're working in, right? They're embedded in particular institutions. So, but what they also are is humans that live in our culture. So they generally, unless they themselves are really experts on adolescents, and some are, they generally think the same things as other people. So you do pitch it, I think you pitch it somewhat differently while still staying true to the same frames, because you are communicating into the same sort of ecosystem of understanding, even with policymakers.
Gotcha. Well, I just noticed the time and we are actually at the end of our time. So thank you again to all of our audience members for attending, and to our speakers, or to our speaker, Marissa, and our moderator, Bethany. That was really, really fascinating. And again, you all can follow up. Marissa, is your email on the Frameworks website?
It is. It's on, yeah.
Okay. And then just one last reminder before you leave that you will get a survey. Please fill out the evaluation. We are really trying to tweak our programming in the new age of virtual events. So any feedback you have is really helpful for us. So thank you again, everyone. Round of applause for our speakers, and have a great rest of your day and week.
Thank you.